Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perek Chet, Mishna Yud Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Radbai, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. Like we learned in Mishnah 9, one may pour out wastewater in a courtyard with an area less than 4 by 4 amot if it has a cesspool. This Mishnah discusses pouring out water into such a courtyard on Shabbat if no Eruvin Chatzeot was made. Now, the word V'chen is deleted by many commentators, including Rav, Rashi, and Rambam, because the ruling of this Mishnah is not directly related to the ruling of the previous one, and the word V'chen means, and so too. So we will skip the word in the parentheses. The Mishnah begins, Shete diutaot zu cheneged zu. If two upper stories of two buildings are opposite each other, with a courtyard of less than 4 amot between them, miksatana su'uka, and some of its residents, the one on one side of the courtyard made a cesspool in it, umiksatan lo su'uka, and some of them, those on the other side, did not make a cesspool in it. The law is as follows, etcha su'uka mutarin. Those who made the cesspool are permitted to pour their wastewater onto the floor of the upper story so that it falls into the cesspool in the courtyard. Now the commentators explain they may pour out the water near an opening, let's say an open balcony that faces the courtyard, causing it to fall into the courtyard below. Now although the rabbis prohibited pouring into a courtyard if it will flow out into a public domain like we learned in Mishnah 9, they permitted pouring water onto an upper floor that will then fall into a courtyard that has no eruv. Now, since even carrying directly into a courtyard lacking an eruv is only rabbinically prohibited, they were lenient with indirect carrying into such a courtyard. But those who did not make the cesspool are prohibited to pour their water into the courtyard on Shabbat, even indirectly, because they might instead carry the water down into the courtyard and pour directly into the cesspool. Now, they would therefore violate the prohibition of carrying in a courtyard without an eruv, and the rabbis therefore prohibited even indirect pouring. And the commentators explain, since there is some distance between their upper story apartments and the cesspool, they might want to avoid pouring indirectly into the cesspool because this would dirty the courtyard. The residents who made the cesspool, however, do not have this issue because they dig the cesspool close to their side of the courtyard. And that is the end of Perek Chet, Mishnah Yud Aleph. We continue now with Perek Tet, Mishnah Aleph. The rabbis prohibited carrying between a house and a courtyard without an eruv because it resembles carrying from a private domain to a public domain. Now, there are two elements that make the house appear like a different domain from the courtyard. Number one, the house is owned by one person or family, whereas the courtyard is also owned by others. And number two, the house is used regularly by its occupants while the courtyard is used by others, which makes the difference in their ownerships very obvious. Now, our Mishnah discusses the law of carrying between private areas that are owned by different people, but not used that regularly. Kol gagot ha'ir reshut achat. All the rooftops of a city are considered one domain, even though the houses beneath them are occupied by different residents. And the Rashi explains on page 92a in Masechet Eruvin, the rooftops in the times of the Mishnah were flat and therefore usable. Now, since the rooftop themselves are not used regularly, they are not considered separate domains from one another, meaning even though the rooftops belong to the houses beneath them and the houses are considered separate from one another, the rooftops are not. And therefore one may carry from one rooftop to another even without an eruv. Ubilvad shelo yeh gag gavoa asara o namuch asara. As long as one rooftop is not 10 tefachim higher or 10 tefachim lower than the other rooftop. If they are, there is a special rabbinic prohibition against carrying between them. Div Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, the Rav explains, the rabbis prohibited carrying between any two areas that have a 10 tefach height difference between them, even if the two areas are in the same private domain. The rabbis were concerned that people might think it's permitted to pick an item up from a public domain and place it on a mound 10 tefachim high that is standing in the private domain. That mound, if it's 4 tefachim wide, is actually a full-fledged private domain, and placing something on it while standing in the public domain would violate the law of transferring. So the rabbis, according to Rabbi Meir, made this special prohibition against carrying between any two areas that have a 10 tefach height difference between them, even if the two areas are in the same private domain. V'chachamim omrim, but the sages, they say, kol echad ve'echad reshut b'fnei atzmo. They disagree with Rabbi Meir's first point. Each rooftop is a separate domain because they are treated the same as the houses beneath them. Therefore, just as we may not carry from one house to the other without an eruv, so too we may not carry from one rooftop to another unless there is an eruv between the houses. And the commentators explain the sages also disagree with the Meir's special decree. They hold that it is permitted to carry in a private domain between places with different heights. Therefore, if the houses did join in an eruv, one may carry between any two rooftops regardless of the difference in their heights. Now, Rabbi Shimon Omer, the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon says, Echad gagot, ve'echad chatzerot, ve'echad karpefot, rooftops, courtyards, and karpefot, which are enclosures that are not used as living space, which the commentators explain. The Mishnah is referring to a karpef with an area of no more than 100 by 50 amot. A larger karpef has the same status of a kalmanit, and one may not carry from it to any private domain or vice versa. So the Mishnah is specifically talking about an area of no more than 100 by 50 amot. But Rabbi Shimon says the rooftops, the courtyards, and the karpefs, reshut achat, they are all considered one domain because they are not used regularly, and one may carry from one to the other even without an eruv. Now the Mishnah says, in what regards is Rabbi Shimon talking about? Likelim sheshavtu letochan. Only with regard to utensils that began Shabbat inside one of these areas, velo lechelim sheshavtu betoch habayit, but not with regard to utensils that began Shabbat in a house. Meaning, if a utensil was on the roof or in the courtyard when Shabbat began, it may be carried to any of these other outdoor enclosures. However, if it began Shabbat in a house and was then taken out to one of these outdoor enclosures, even in a permitted way, for example, when there is an eruv for all the houses of the courtyard so that it would be permitted to carry out of the house into the courtyard onto the rooftop, Rabbi Shimon says one may not carry that item to another outdoor enclosure unless there is an eruv between the house and the second enclosure. The reason being because the item is viewed as if it's being carried directly from the house where it began Shabbat to the second enclosure. And the commentaries explain, Rabbi Meir and the sages also agree that any item that began Shabbat in a house may not be carried to any domain that has no eruv with that house. When Rabbi Meir permitted carrying from rooftop to rooftop without an eruv, he did so only for utensils that began Shabbat on the rooftop. So the Art Scroll notes concludes that it follows from this that eruvei chatzerot is needed only to allow carrying between houses and a courtyard, or to allow carrying in a courtyard items that began Shabbat in a house. However, things that were in the courtyard when Shabbat began may be carried in the courtyard and between courtyards even without an eruv. Now, when we learned in the previous chapters, according to Rabbi Shimon, that carrying is prohibited between courtyards that do not have a common eruv, it's only in regard to carrying items that were in a house when Shabbat began. And the Rav does tell us, V'alacha ke Rabbi Shimon, the halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.